In the small, sleepy town of Elmswood, a chilling fog often swept through the streets, thick and persistent as it cloaked the town in an eerie silence. It was here that Grace Thompson, a young nurse with a keen interest in the paranormal, had recently started working the night shift at St. Margaret's Hospital, an old establishment with creaky floors and dimly lit hallways that spoke of decades past. Grace's shift began as any other. The clock struck 10 p.m., marking the start of her duty in the west wing of the hospital, an area notorious among staff for strange occurrences, whispers in the dark, sudden cold drafts, and fleeting shadows in the corner of one's eye. Grace, both excited and apprehensive, made her rounds, checking on patients, most of whom were sound asleep or too sedated to notice her presence. As she approached room 113, the air grew inexplicably colder. This room was unoccupied, a fact that did little to comfort her as she pushed open the door to make sure everything was in order. The moment she stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind her with a force that echoed down the corridor. Startled, Grace spun around, her heart pounding, but there was nothing there, just the sound of her own ragged breathing. Attempting to calm her nerves, Grace approached the window to open it, thinking the door must have been caught by a draft. However, the window wouldn't budge. As she struggled with the latch, a whisper floated through the room, "Leave." The voice was so faint, Grace thought she might have imagined it. She turned around, scanning the dark corners of the room, but saw nothing. Shaking her head, she decided it was just her mind playing tricks on her. The night progressed, and Grace continued her rounds, but the feeling of unease never left her. At around 3 a.m., she was making her way back past room 113 when she heard the sound of an old music box playing. It was coming from inside the room. Curiosity overcame her fear, and she pushed the door open once more. The room was bathed in moonlight, casting long shadows across the floor. On the windowsill, an old, dusty music box was open, its haunting melody playing to an empty room. Grace approached the music box, her fingers trembling as she reached out to close it. The moment she touched it, the music stopped abruptly, and a cold hand grasped her wrist. She screamed, pulling away, but there was nothing there. Her hand was red as though from a tight grip. Panicking, she ran from the room, the sound of her footsteps loud in the oppressive silence of the hallway. Back at the nurse's station, Grace tried to regain her composure. She was certain she hadn't imagined the hand, the red marks were proof enough. The rest of the night was a blur of anxiety and jumping at every small noise. When her shift finally ended at 7 a.m., she was more than eager to leave the haunted corridors of St. Margaret's behind. But as she clocked out, the head nurse, an elderly woman named Mrs. Harrow, stopped her. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, a knowing look in her eyes. Grace hesitated, then decided to confide in her about the night's events. Mrs. Harrow listened intently, nodding occasionally. When Grace finished, Mrs. Harrow sighed, a deep, sorrowful sound. "You're not the first to experience such things, especially near room 113, she began, her voice low. "It's said that room is haunted by a former patient who died under mysterious circumstances. Many believe she still roams the halls, unable to leave." Chilled by her words, Grace felt a new wave of fear wash over her. She had agreed to work another night shift the following day, and the thought of facing the ghostly presence again filled her with dread. Mrs. Harrow seemed to read her thoughts. "Be careful, Grace. Some spirits are not just remnants of the past, they can influence the present more than you know." With that ominous warning, Grace left the hospital, the morning sun doing little to warm the chill that had settled deep in her bones. As she walked to her car, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her from the hospital windows, waiting for her return. And it was this impending return that filled her with both dread and a compelling intrigue. How could she, drawn as she was to the mysteries of the unknown, not go back? What secrets did the halls of St. Margaret's hold? What was the story of the spirit that could not find peace? These questions plagued her as she prepared herself for another night at St. Margaret's, unaware of the true extent of the terror that awaited her. Continuing from where we left off, Grace spent the day trying to distract herself from the memories of the previous night, but images of the ghostly hand and the haunting music box replayed in her mind like a broken film reel. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across her small apartment, the inevitability of her return to St. Margaret's weighed heavily on her. Pulling into the hospital parking lot, the building loomed ominously under the crescent moon. Its windows, black and uninviting, stared down at her like hollow eyes. With a deep breath to steady her nerves, Grace stepped out of her car and into the chilly night air. The wind seemed to whisper through the trees as if warning her to stay away. Inside, the hospital was quiet, the only sounds the distant echo of footsteps and the intermittent beep of a heart monitor. Grace clocked in, her hands shaking slightly as she pinned her nurse badge to her uniform. The night seemed to stretch out before her, endless and foreboding. As she made her way to the west wing, the air grew colder, a familiar chill that now sent shivers down her spine. She paused outside room 113, hesitating. The door was slightly ajar, as if inviting her in. Taking a deep breath, Grace pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was cold, colder than the rest of the hospital, and dimly lit by the light from the hallway. The moonlight streamed through the window, casting eerie shadows across the floor. The music box sat closed on the windowsill, silent now, but its presence was like a palpable weight in the room. Grace approached it slowly, her eyes never leaving the wooden box as if expecting it to spring to life at any moment. She reached out, hesitated, then flipped the lid open. Silence. No music played, no ghostly whispers, just silence. Relieved, yet still on edge, she closed the lid and turned to leave. As she did, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. Her breath became visible in the air, and the door slammed shut with a bang that made her jump. From the dark corner of the room, a figure slowly emerged, a woman, dressed in the faded gown of a patient, her hair wild and eyes hollow. Grace froze, her heart hammering in her chest as the figure moved closer, limping, her movements jerky and unnatural. "Help me," the figure whispered, her voice a raspy echo that filled the room. Grace, her instincts as a nurse kicking in despite her fear, took a step forward. "What can I do? How can I help you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure stopped, tilting her head as if puzzled by the question. "Free me," she replied, her voice growing louder, more urgent. "Free me from this torment." Grace felt a chill run through her body. I don't understand. What's keeping you here?" "The pain, the betrayal," the figure murmured, her voice fading in and out like a bad radio signal. They didn't listen, they didn't see. As she spoke, the air around Grace seemed to grow denser, the shadows darker. The figure's face contorted in a grimace of pain and sorrow, and then she was rushing towards Grace, faster than seemed possible. Grace screamed, backing away, but the doors were locked, the windows shut tight. The ghostly patient reached out, her hands icy as they brushed against Grace's arm. Images flooded Grace's mind, flashes of surgery, shouting doctors, a mistake, a deadly mistake. The vision ended as quickly as it had begun, leaving Grace gasping for air, her heart racing. The room returned to normal, the temperature rising, but the echo of the woman's pain lingered. Shaken, Grace left the room, the weight of what she had experienced pressing down on her. She knew then that she could not leave this mystery unsolved. There was a story here, a tragedy that needed to be righted, and somehow, she felt compelled to help. But as she made her rounds, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, shadows flickering at the edge of her vision, whispers trailing in her wake. Something dark lingered in the halls of St. Margaret's, and Grace knew her night was far from over. As she moved through the darkened corridors, every shadow seemed to shift, every sound a warning. What secrets did the walls of this old hospital hold? And what would they demand of her before the night was over? Unbeknownst to Grace, her journey into the supernatural was just beginning, the hospital's dark past ready to unfold before her, each shadow ready to reveal its story. The night was deep, the darkness complete, and somewhere in the bowels of the hospital, something stirred, awakened by her presence and ready to make itself known. Grace's night shift had taken a turn into the corridors of the supernatural, each moment unfolding deeper layers of the haunted hospital's history. The faint echo of footsteps followed her as she navigated the shadow-drenched halls, the oppressive atmosphere thickening with each step. Every creak of the aging floorboards, every whisper of the wind through the cracks, seemed to carry voices from another time, beckoning her deeper into the mystery. Pushing forward, Grace's next stop was the records room, a dusty archive filled with old patient files and forgotten histories. The room was at the end of a seldom-used corridor, its door usually locked, but tonight, it was inexplicably ajar. Hesitant yet compelled, Grace entered, the door creaking ominously behind her. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of mold and decaying paper. The only light came from a flickering bulb that cast more shadows than it dispelled. She began to sift through the old files, her fingers tracing the faded ink on brittle paper, searching for any clue about the woman in room 113. As she delved into the archives, the whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices that seemed desperate to be heard. Each file told a story of pain and despair, of lives cut short under mysterious circumstances. But it was a file marked with a red X that caught her attention, a file much thicker than the others. Opening it, Grace discovered it was the file of a woman named Eleanor Rigby, a patient who had died at St. Margaret's under suspicious circumstances over 50 years ago. The details were scarce, the reports sanitized, but one thing was clear, Eleanor's death was not as it seemed. The more Grace read, the stronger the feeling of being watched became. Suddenly, the lights flickered out, plunging the room into darkness. Grace's heart leapt into her throat as she fumbled for her flashlight. Clicking it on, she shone it around the room, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The beam of light fell on a figure standing in the corner, the same ghostly presence from room 113. "Eleanor. Why won't they let me leave?" the apparition asked, her voice a hollow echo of despair. "I'm trying to find out," Grace answered, her voice trembling. "I'll find out what happened to you, I promise." Eleanor's figure seemed to flicker, like a bad television signal, before disappearing entirely. Grace was alone again, the silence oppressive. She gathered the file and other documents that could help piece together the tragic story, her resolve strengthening. She needed answers, not just for Eleanor, but for herself. The hospital held its breath around her, the walls whispering secrets just out of reach. Leaving the records room, Grace felt a chill wind that seemed to come from nowhere, sending papers fluttering to the ground like ghostly birds taking flight. She hurried back to the main part of the hospital, the weight of the files in her hand a reminder of the tangible link to the past. But the hospital was not done with her yet. As she passed an old, disused operating room, the door suddenly swung open, revealing a scene of surgical instruments laid out on a tray, as if ready for a procedure. The room was supposed to be closed off, unused for years, yet here it was, looking as though it was waiting for the next patient, or the next victim. Tentatively, Grace stepped inside. The air was cold, colder than anywhere else in the hospital, and she could see her breath as she exhaled. The lights flickered above, casting strange shadows on the walls. Then, without warning, the door slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Trapped, Grace turned to the operating table in the center of the room. There, laid out, was a surgical gown, stained with something dark and ominous. As she approached, the lights flickered more violently, a low moan filling the room. It was a sound of unimaginable pain and fear, and it froze Grace to her core. She realized then that the operating room was a place of horrors, a room where unspeakable things had happened. The gown, the instruments, the stains, they all told a story of a time when medicine was not just about healing. It was about experimentation, about crossing lines that should never have been crossed. As the realization dawned on her, the moaning grew louder, more desperate. It was as if the souls of those who had suffered here were reaching out to her, begging for release. Grace knew she couldn't leave them like this, couldn't leave this story untold. She needed to find a way out, needed to bring the truth to light. But as the room grew colder, and the shadows darker, Grace understood that the path to the truth was fraught with danger. The hospital was alive, its past pulsing through the darkened corridors, through the creaky floors, and into the very air she breathed. It didn't just want her to know its secrets, it seemed to relish her fear, feeding off it as the night dragged on. Grace steadied herself, her breath visible in the frigid air of the operating room. The spectral moans ebbed and flowed, a chorus of the damned that echoed off the sterile, tiled walls. She needed to escape, to breathe fresh air, to think. With trembling hands, she pushed against the heavy door. It didn't budge. Panic clawed at her throat as the realization hit, she was locked in. Determined not to succumb to fear, Grace turned her attention to the room. The operating table, the instruments, the eerie stains on the gown, all of it seemed to pulsate with a dark history. She approached the table slowly, her flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. On the table, next to the gown, lay a set of old, rusted surgical tools, each piece meticulously arranged as though waiting for the next procedure to begin. Then, the lights flickered and steadied, casting a steady, unnerving glow over the room. From the shadows, a figure materialized at the head of the table. Not the woman from room 113, but a man, his features gaunt, his eyes hollow pits of despair and madness. He wore the garb of an old surgeon, blood-stained and tattered. They didn't understand, he whispered, his voice a chilling blend of regret and menace. I had to go further, had to know more. Grace backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. Who are you? She managed to ask, her voice barely a whisper. I was the chief surgeon, he replied, moving closer, his form flickering like a flame in a draft. They called me a monster, a butcher. But science, progress, requires sacrifice. Grace felt the cold seep deeper into her bones. She knew she had to keep him talking, to learn the secrets he held. What did you do here? She asked, her voice steadier now. The mind, he continued, as if relishing the memory, is a fascinating organ. So much potential, so much power. We had to unlock it, understand its depths, its resilience. The instruments on the table seemed to glimmer with a malevolent light, as if eager to be used once more. And the patients? Grace asked, her disgust rising. Volunteers, he hissed, his voice dripping with insincerity. Sacrifices for the greater good. Some even survived. Grace's flashlight flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, the room seemed to close in on her. When the light steadied, the surgeon was inches from her face, his breath cold as the grave. And now, you are here. Another seeker of truth. She stepped back, bumping into the table, the cold metal sending a shiver up her spine. I'm not like you, she stated, her resolve hardening. I'm here to end this, to free those you've tormented. A laugh, hollow and haunting, echoed around the room. And this. You're just another chapter in the ongoing experiment. And believe me, it is far from over. With a swift movement, he vanished, and the door clicked open, as if releasing her from the confrontation. Grace didn't hesitate. She fled the room, her breath ragged, her mind reeling with the horrors she had witnessed. She knew then that the hospital was a labyrinth of nightmares, each room, each corridor holding its own ghastly tale. As she rushed through the dimly lit hallways, her way lit only by the faltering beam of her flashlight, the voices grew louder, a cacophony of whispers, cries, and laughter. The hospital was alive with the echoes of the past, each victim of the monstrous surgeon calling out to her, entreating her to uncover the truth, to bring light to the darkness. Room by room, Grace documented her findings, her hands shaking but her spirit undeterred. She encountered spirits, some malevolent, twisting in their eternal torment, others merely shadows, lost and confused. Each encounter left her more determined, but also more drained, the weight of the hospital's sins heavy on her shoulders. As dawn approached, the shadows seemed to retreat, the oppressive atmosphere lifting slightly. But Grace knew this was only a temporary respite. The day staff would soon arrive, oblivious to the night's terrors. She needed to prepare, to gather evidence, to convince others of the need to confront the hospital's dark past. Her night shift had ended, but her work was just beginning. As she stepped outside, the first light of dawn casting long shadows on the ground, she realized that her fight was far from over. The hospital, with its twisted corridors and haunted rooms, would call to her again as the sun set, pulling her back into its depths where the darkness held sway. As Grace left the grounds of St. Margaret's, the crisp morning air did little to cleanse the dread that clung to her. The hospital stood menacingly silent in the dawn light, its windows like dark, watchful eyes. Throughout the day, her mind replayed the horrors witnessed, the voices heard, and the chilling encounter with the ghostly surgeon. But it was more than just replaying, it was a brewing storm, gathering her resolve and courage for what must be done next. Determined, Grace spent the day gathering information from old newspapers and public records, piecing together the grim history of St. Margaret's. She learned of unexplained disappearances, experimental surgeries, and the revered yet feared surgeon who led many of those operations. The pieces of a sinister puzzle were coming together, all leading back to the hospital. As night approached, Grace equipped herself with more than just her flashlight. This time, she brought a digital voice recorder and a camera. Her mission was clear: to document the paranormal activities, to gather undeniable proof of the supernatural horrors that plagued the hospital. Returning to the hospital, Grace's arrival was met with an unsettling silence, acquired before the storm. The corridors seemed to watch her, the shadows more oppressive, as if the hospital itself was aware of her intentions and bracing for a confrontation. Her first stop was the operating room where she had encountered the ghostly surgeon. This time, the door swung open with eerie silence, welcoming her into its dark embrace. Grace stepped inside, her tools ready. She set up the camera on a tripod, pointing it towards the operating table, and turned on the voice recorder. "Show yourself," she called into the darkness, her voice steady but her heart racing. "I'm not afraid of you anymore." The air grew colder, the shadows deepening. Then, the flickering light steadied and the surgeon appeared, his figure more defined, almost corporeal. "You return," he hissed, his voice a chilling scrape. "Why do you seek the truth when ignorance is such bliss?" "To free the souls you've tormented, including yours," Grace replied, her voice echoing slightly in the cold room. A laugh, more grotesque and menacing than before, filled the room. "Foolish girl. You think you have power here. This is my domain." As he spoke, the shadows moved as if alive, swirling around the room, coalescing into forms, ghostly patience, their expressions twisted in eternal agony. Grace held her ground, her camera and recorder capturing every moment. "I know what you did here," she continued, her eyes locked on the surgeon. "And I've documented it all. Your horrors will be exposed." Anger contorted the surgeon's face, and with a wave of his hand, the ghostly patients lunged towards Grace. She stepped back, dodging them, her heart pounding. They were terrifying, but they couldn't touch her, not physically. They were echoes of the past, their power residing only in fear. "You cannot stop what has been set in motion," the surgeon declared, advancing towards her. "This hospital, these halls, will forever be under my control." Grace felt the weight of his malevolent presence, but her resolve was firmer. "No," she said defiantly. "I will end this. For all the souls you've wronged, for the peace this place needs." Her declaration seemed to resonate through the hospital, a palpable wave of energy that challenged the darkness. The ghostly figures halted, their expressions softening, turning towards the surgeon with dawning awareness and anger. "You have no power over us anymore," one spectral patient cried out, and the others joined in, their voices a chorus of defiance. The surgeon's face twisted in fury as he realized his control was slipping. He turned back to Grace, his form beginning to fade. "You will not win," he snarled, disappearing into the shadows that had once bolstered him. With the surgeon gone, the atmosphere lightened palpably. The ghostly patients looked to Grace, gratitude evident in their ethereal faces before they, too, began to fade, their forms dissipating into motes of light that drifted upwards and vanished. Breathing heavily, Grace turned off her camera and recorder, her hands shaking. The evidence was captured, the horrors documented. But she knew the fight wasn't over. There was still much to do, the evidence had to be shown, the stories told, and the hospital cleansed thoroughly of its dark past. As she gathered her equipment, Grace felt a newfound strength. She wasn't just a nurse, she was a guardian now, a protector against the dark forces that preyed on the innocent. And as she walked out of the operating room, the halls of St. Margaret's Hospital seemed to sigh in relief, the shadows receding, as if ready to embrace.